I am Linda Leavell, President of Bio, and am pleased to welcome you to the keynote lecture of the 2021 Bio Conference, and also to present the Bio Award to David Levering Lewis. The Bio Award is our organization's highest and oldest honor, awarded to an individual for contributions to advancing the art and craft of biography. The first Bio Award was presented at our first conference in 2010 to Gene Strauss. Subsequent winners are Robert Caro, Arnold Rampersad, Ron Chernow, Stacy Schiff, Taylor Branch, Claire Tomlin, Candace Millard, Richard Holmes, James McGrath Morris, and Hermione Lee. Here to introduce David Levering Lewis is his friend and colleague, Pamela Newkirk. Both David and Pamela are Bio members. Pamela is an author, journalist, and professor at New York University. She is the author of 5 books, the fourth of which is a biography, Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga. I now present Pamela Newkirk.
It is a pleasure and indeed a great honor to introduce Dr. David Levering Lewis, one of America's most acclaimed historians and authors, who I have had the good fortune to know as a friend, mentor, and as a New York University colleague. Among his many books are several biographies, including King, a critical biography, the first scholarly biography of Dr. King, W.E.B. DuBois, Biography of a Race, for which he was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for biography, a Bancroft Prize in history, and the Francis Parkman Prize, and W.E.B. DuBois, The Fight for Equality in the American Century, which received a second Pulitzer Prize for biography. His most recent biography, The Improbable Wendell Willkie, the definitive biography of Willkie, was published in 2018. David has received practically every coveted prize in arts and letters. He is a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations and the American Academy in Berlin. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Gallery, and in 2010, President Obama awarded him the National Humanities Medal. In 2015, he received the Arthur Meyer Schlesinger Jr. Distinguished Service Prize from the Society of Historians, and the same year, an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Columbia University. I can go on and on, but know that you, like me, are eager to hear from him. Suffice it to say that we at Bio are thrilled to add his name to the list of illustrious honorees. Congratulations, David.
Oh my. Thank you so much. I should hold this like this over my heart and put it aside for future reference and admiration. Thank you so much, Pamela Newkirk. We've known each other for a number of years. I've greatly admired you and your scholarship, and it's very humbling and satisfactory to have the favor returned. I've entitled my keynote, Black Biography Matters, a Prophet and a President. He was the only student of African descent in his competitive high school, a circumstance that might have made him more self-conscious than he was had it not been for the precociousness that made book learning easy. And even if he had wanted to slide by in his studies, his autobiography tells us that underachievement was barred shut by a single-minded mother who knew that college was her only son's ticket to success in the larger world. A curious determination was concealed in her softness, he recalled. Now, the father had deserted the family to make a professional second start soon after his son's birth, leaving the boy's mother to depend on her own imagination and industry and modest help from relatives. It mattered that the boy thought that his birth was legitimate, although he would eventually learn that his roving father had failed to mention a previous marriage still intact. Even then, the son would continue to dream of his father in faraway places, pursuing a career. He grew up near water and surrounded by mountains in a pleasant place relatively free of overt racial animus toward dark-skinned people. His status as a college-bound student put him in the company of the sons and daughters of the local rich and powerful, a social access much advantaged by having a parent whose pigment and features were white. The ease with which he managed to wear his mixed racial heritage began to fray, however, in the senior year of high school as the decision about college impended. Leaving the relaxed racial environment of home, he wrote of the need to find a fixed identity in the much sharper black and white divisions he would encounter at college and in the larger society. He was beset by a crippling indeterminacy, a fear, he said, of forever remaining an outsider with the rest of the world, black and white, always standing in judgment. Although there was some brief wavering between the poles of whiteness and blackness, he gradually embraced his African roots at a small liberal arts college and at a great Ivy League university. Indeed, he became, as he was pleased to say of his college experience, quite willing to be a Negro and to work with the Negro group. Then came the professional training at Harvard, where his academic distinctions were unprecedented. Another autobiographical passage confessed the need for a community where he could put down stakes and test my commitments. Fair to say, the young man claimed that his identity was in some sense the exercise of an option, an existential commitment made not because he had to be black, a person born immutably black, but because he decided to embrace the culture and aspirations of black Americans. Many of you will have guessed the identity of this racially ambiguous young man as one Barack Hussein Obama. You would have guessed correctly. But had you guessed that the subject is William Edward Burghardt DuBois, your choice would be equally correct. For what you have heard is the result of the splicing together of strikingly similar biographical profiles and the interweaving of like-minded quotations taken from DuBois's autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, and Obama's Dreams from My Father. The objective of this biographical license is to explore the significance of a largely unsuspected parallelism in the racial coming of age of two of the most influential American men of the last 100 years. DuBois, born in February 153 years ago in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Obama, announcing his presidential campaign on the steps of the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, 14 Februaries ago. More than a century and a half stretches between these February dates, yet it may be claimed without exaggeration that the surprising political event in Springfield on February 10, 2007, was inextricably linked to the birth in Great Barrington on February 23, 1868. Ergo, no Obama presidency without the DuBois civil rights legacy. As the very personification of status quo defiance, DuBois exposed as fraud an American democracy based on enforced racial separation, and he became the piston that drove the intellectual and organizational dismantlement of Jim Crow. He accomplished much by his pioneering social science scholarship, investigative journalism, and militant propaganda yoked to organized protest. And the long march out of the 1896 constitutional paradox of separate but equal to the illusory 1954 equivocation of all deliberate speed would have been even longer and harder without the mind and pen of W.E.B. Du Bois. His death at age 95 on the day before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom foretold the next epic chapter in the ongoing struggle of people of color to close the gap between their country's ideals and its realities. Interestingly, William Du Bois made an existential decision near the end of the 19th century, like Barack Obama during the end of the 20th, under the illusion that he could have chosen otherwise, that by New England culture and education and his somewhat indeterminate racial appearance, he could choose not to become a second-class citizen. Du Bois found his calling soon after leaving his pleasant village in the mountains of western Massachusetts, where black families were rarer than Democrats, that he saw his illustrious civil rights vocation in such existential terms was summed up shortly before his death in 1963, when his second autobiography, a soliloquy on viewing my life from the last decade of its first century, insisted that, but for the race problem, he might have become, quote, an unquestioning worshipper in the shrine of the established social order into which he was born. But just that part of this order, which seemed to most of my fellows nearest perfection, was for Du Bois most inequitable and wrong. And starting from that critique, I gradually, as the years went by, found other things to question. The existential chords in Barack Hussein Obama's Dreams from My Father, a story of race and inheritance, are differently sounded in what journalist Charlene Hunter Galt aptly described as one of the most powerful books of self-discovery I have ever read. I would add that Dreams from My Father might well be the most revelatory personal narrative ever written by a major American public figure, certainly by an occupant of the Oval Office. Obama's odyssey from Hawaii to the mainland was advantaged by a hindsight that allowed him, by the time he left Harvard as the first minority editor of the Harvard Law Review, to construct a coherent African-American persona. He tells us that in his search for a fixed self or coherent identity in high school and undergraduate college, he was put off by the anguish in the writings of Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison, and James Baldwin. Each man finally forced to doubt art's redemptive power. Each man finally forced to withdraw, one to Africa, one to Europe, one deeper into the bowels of Harlem. Obama sighed. All of them exhausted, bitter men, the devil at their heels. As is discernible from Washington Post journalist David Baranis' comprehensive biography, Barack Obama, The Story, a somewhat speculative recapitulation from Harvard philosopher James Kloppenberg's Reading Obama, a somewhat speculative recapitulation of the 44th president's intellectual formation, Obama constructed his cultural persona piecemeal over time, cautiously, pragmatically, strategically, until the day when his mainland evolution as a black man with white ancestry was fully achieved within the chrysalis of his wife's gregarious South Side Chicago family and friends. He had learned over time how to choose what worked best for him from his self-willed and perennial graduate student mother, his devoted white middle American grandparents, the Indonesian army man stepfather who taught him to box, the peers who came in multiple colors that mostly were lighter than his, and above all, from his dark totem, the absent Kenyan father. I was raised, Barack Obama tells us, as an Indonesian child, and a Hawaiian child, and a black child, and a white child, and so, he says, what I benefited from is a multiplicity of cultures that all fed me. One understands why one of his most perceptive interpreters, the Indian sociologist Dinesh Sharma, described Obama as the first global president, a leader whose understanding is truly transnational. Similarly, one must ponder Moranis's discovery that because of his subject's need to absorb all the traditions, the future president's ambition had always been to subsume divisions of culture and society, politics and economics in a cool consensus of no drama Obama pragmatism. True to the title of Obama's campaign book, The Audacity of Hope, it was true it was inspired by one Reverend Jeremiah Wright's sermons. Yet one might have predicted early on that neither Reverend Wright's standing nor the intrepid title would be secure from the book's underlying political science optimism. Candidate Obama insisted that facile expectations and simple explanations are being constantly upended. Most evangelicals are more tolerant than the media would have us believe. Most secularists are more spiritual. Most rich people want the poor to succeed. The political labels of liberal and conservative rarely track people's personal attributes. Perhaps not quite a belief that this is the best of all possible worlds, but such a conflict-averse statement in the Audacity of Hope did suggest an above-the-fray high-mindedness that could be problematic. As campaign message, nevertheless, candidate Obama channeled an e pluribus unum mythos of American exceptionalism as seldom before by a credible public figure. Not only did he minimize the significance of political labels, but racism was seen as an old problem that the candidate's generation, he called it the Joshua generation, could refute and even move beyond, as it honored Rosa, Whitney, John Lewis, and Martin of the Moses generation. Freshman Senator Obama had made an unforgettable debut at the 2004 Democratic Convention, where he struck a memorable exceptionalist chord by assuring us that there is not a black America and white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. Racism, he wrote in Audacity, was subject to refutation. Amazingly, candidate Obama served up an incomparably fine refutation of a 250-year-old scourge at Philadelphia's Constitutional Center, where he succeeded for the first time in American public debate in triangulating race, class, otherness, and opportunity in proclaiming that his life story had seared into my genetic makeup the idea that this nation is more than the sum of its parts, the candidate had turned the race wedge on itself by transforming the third rail of national politics into a causeway from original sin to American exceptionalism at its finest. In so doing, Barack Obama, the first non-white president, had seemed to resolve those dilemmas of nationality and color unforgettably posed by DuBois's foundational text, The Souls of Black Folk. The media, the public pontificators, the liberal establishment, and even much of red state America crooned about the dawning of a post-racial nation. By contrast, DuBois had set the ground rules for American race relations almost 120 years ago in a prediction whose concise language had been internalized by generations of African Americans and conceded as unalterable gospel by the American majority, that the problem of the century was the color line. But DuBois's famous color line problem was actually a problem without color, for it was starkly black and white. He could have had no conception that our 21st century would not be piebald, however, but brown, red, yellow, and as well as white and black and increasingly minority white. But even so, to concede that a historic racial dyad had been displaced by a polychrome present does not mean DuBois might well have argued, were he among us to assess the meaning of white supremacist militancy and GOP political legislative obstructionism, that race has been transcended as a potent and perdurable force in our national life. Rather, he could remind us that he predicted that race still would remain the predicate of our American experience long after the formal dismantling of segregation. Whitewashing Race, the myth of a colorblind society, a timely book after DuBois's own mind, posited a potent racialist paradox exactly as DuBois would have anticipated. The authors write that in a historically white society, color brings problems, and if people of color cry foul, if they call attention to the way they are treated or to racial inequity, if they try to change the distribution of advantage, if they try to adjust the rules of the game, white Americans, whose race and racial advantage are invisible, see them as seeking special privileges. They are seen as troublemakers. Candidate Barack Obama presented himself as racially untroublesome and reassuringly pragmatic. As public intellectual Michael Eric Dyson told NPR journalist Gwen Ifill, Obama had winked reassuringly at African American voters while articulating an agenda designed for universal appeal. One might say that the 44th president had entered office as a reassuring reformer whose agenda of change might have seemed just progressive enough to intrigue old troublemaker DuBois. After all, Barack Obama's powerful mantra of change gave millions good reason to expect a democratic small d reset, a clean break with warmongering, cultural obscurantism, the unfeeling incompetence of Katrina, and material relief from the geyser of wealth rising above the rest of us. A government that truly represents these Americans, the audacity of hope promised, will require a different kind of politics. It won't be prepackaged and ready to pull off the shelf. No way. 5 years after DuBois's death, in self-imposed exile in Ghana. Still lucid and confrontational at 95, Martin Luther King Jr. praised Du Bois as the sage history cannot ignore. When Dr. King spoke those words to a capacity audience in Carnegie Hall, February 23, 1968, Dr. Du Bois had been virtually excised from his country's mainstream narrative as a Marxist scourge whose warnings against omnivorous capitalism disconcerted liberals and enraged plutocrats. The organized effort of American industry to usurp government surpasses anything in modern history, he had thundered in one of his last editorials in Monthly Review. Long before his demise, Du Bois had modified his famous prophecy about the primacy of race in the 20th century. The fundamental problem was not racial inequality, but the economic inequality of the races, he decided. Because the meaningful understanding of race was inseparable from the mitigation of economic inequality, Du Bois might well have anticipated distressful outcomes from a presidency in which race seemed to be of incidental importance. Yet all must recall election night, November 2008, when President-elect Obama spoke to a tearfully exultant nation from Chicago's Grant Park. As the first black president spoke, a deeply moved Congressman John Lewis said, "We have witnessed tonight in America a revolution of values, a revolution of ideals. There has been a transformation of America, and it will have unbelievable influence on the world." Americans everywhere, high and low, seemed to concur. Journalist Jonathan Alter reported the following exchange on Chicago's LaSalle Street when a white reporter receives congratulations from a working-class African-American. "Congratulations," he said. "Oh, congratulations to you," the reporter replied. "No, it's you folks, the Caucasians, who did this. We who should get the credit. We knew we'd vote for Barack today, but we just weren't sure y'all would." But y'all didn't. White voters went for John McCain 55%. In the euphoric aftermath of the 2008 presidential election, few Americans, irrespective of color, had scrutinized the demography of the results. And so some of us who did, including then NAACP Chairman Julian Bond, recall our submitted op-eds being returned as post-racially inappropriate by the New York Times and the Washington Post. One could imagine how disconcerting would have been an op-ed written in the world-weary spirit of a Du Bois, prognosticating an even larger white majority vote against the president in 2012, as would be the case. Even before the president-elect took office, Robert Kuttner, a leading progressive economist, predicted in a smart little book entitled Obama's Challenge that the president would lose his solid majority in the 2010 midterm congressional elections if he failed to act audaciously. If he did, Kuttner had believed, Obama would enter the special ranks of transformative presidents after Lincoln, comprised of FDR, LBJ, and yes, Ronald Reagan. The transformative presidents know who they are. Transactional presidents are less than the sum of their convictions. Great presidents are not post-partisan, centrist, or too pragmatic or transactional to take risks in the service of principles. Faced with the Civil Rights Revolution, Lyndon Johnson had asked, "Hell, what's the presidency for?" The key to greatness was living up to the audacity of hope, Kuttner and several other economists insisted, which meant turning a deaf ear to the siren songs of conventional economic wisdom. Indisputably, the 47 44-year-old 44th president owed his election to a disaster in which he had played no significant part, the greatest economic meltdown since the Great Depression. Predictably, within a score of weeks in the Oval Office, the party's progressive base was already impatient for a demonstration of presidential activism evocative of the first 100 days of the New Deal. The distress experienced by so many people of color, black and white, was only barely mitigated by disability payments and food stamps. Millions drowning in subprime wastewater demanded that the federal government force Hank Paulson's megabanks to grant them relief. Predictably, the GOP had rebuffed presidential overtures out of hand while simultaneously castigating every proposed mitigation as worse than the problems it addressed. To read the early judgments of Bob Woodward, of Jonathan Alter, Ron Suskind, Paul Krugman, to say little of the skeptical writings of Cornel West and Tavis Smiley, Obama's economic policies fell far short of audacious. Even worse, they seemed almost perversely receptive to alternative recommendations. He's our kind of guy, the new president was reported to have said after interviewing Timothy Geithner for the Treasury Secretaryship. Not only was Geithner an acolyte of Wall Street's Lawrence Summers, but he had forgotten to pay his back taxes. The selection was of a piece with the president's reticence to the economic recommendations of venerable Paul Volcker, the former Federal Reserve chairman, who pushed for a new Glass-Steagall Act to restore the New Deal firewall between investment and commercial banking functions. Volcker's warnings, seconded by neo-Keynesians of the Robert Reich and Laura Tyson stripe, that $1.3 trillion was the minimal stimulus figure necessary to jumpstart the national economy and rebuild America's outdated infrastructure, were deemed politically impractical in the face of Republican resistance. Obama's first-term persistence in a futile strategy of conciliation of his loudest critics puzzled and even enraged many who, like Krugman or Maxine Waters or New Deal pundit Jelani Cobb, and finally the astute Michael Dyson, believed that moderation in the service of change was a vice. It was certainly true that the American people were reliably polled as being tired of Washington's divisiveness, but many veteran observers argued the virtue of, yes, audacity. In any case, the results of the 2010 congressional elections had been even worse than Robert Kuttner had feared, the highest loss of House seats by a president since 1938. Still, by the end of his first term in office, the president had taken bold steps to save the auto industry over the objections of some of his key advisors. He approved of the first Federal Consumer Protection Bureau, albeit without the Harvard professor who conceived and agitated for it, Elizabeth Warren, and also with the concession demanded by the Chamber of Commerce to lodge the Consumer Bureau in Timothy Geithner's Treasury Department. Above all, there was health care reform, the signature accomplishment of the Obama presidency, but also an insurance industry bonanza. As a historian and a biographer, I should resist the temptation to divine the what-if judgments DuBois would have delivered upon the political aftermath of the Obama presidency, were it not that he spoke rather presciently to our times on the 50th anniversary of the publication of Souls of Black Folk. Reissued with a new preface by DuBois himself 10 years before the March on Washington, Souls reiterated that he still thought today as yesterday that the color line is a great problem of the century, But today he saw more clearly than yesterday that back of the problem of race and color lies a greater problem which both obscures and implements it. And that is the fact that so many civilized persons are willing to live in comfort even if the price of this is poverty, ignorance, and disease of the majority of their fellow men. One discerns in the considered statements of both DuBois and Obama on the subject of race in America very different intellectual policy consequences. DuBois's thinking moved from the primacy of racial subordination to the centrality of the economics of class discrimination, yet ever mindful of race as a component of America's DNA, whereas Obama regarded race as of limited value in formulating an economics of redress because he saw a differently constituted American DNA. The president's gestalt was to have awkward, painful consequences both for his most committed, if increasingly frustrated, voting blocs, and indeed also for himself as he confronted fierce opposition from groups who saw themselves as ideologically and culturally delegitimatized and demographically imperiled. For DuBois, racism defined the American social contract. For DuBois, who conceived his persona as the alloy of ingredients in which the African-American experience was to be assimilated, the better not to be imprisoned in it, the less said about race relations, the better. Whether Reverend Wright's fulminations or Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s unwarranted mistreatment by a local cop. In that regard, the winter 2010 issue of Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, presented an engrossing essay collection entitled Race in the Age of Obama, edited by Washington University scholar Gerald Early. Most of the authors were unpersuaded of the vaunted post-racial transmogrification, and they saw race as an abiding problem that dare not speak its name, the great evasion that precluded a systemic overhaul of taxes and institutions that would finally move this country in the direction of honest social democracy. Harvard philosopher Tommy Shelby's contribution, Justice and Racial Conciliation, Two Visions, channeled a DuBoisian suspicion that the Obama administration's universal remedies for social and economic disparities left vast numbers of poor and black and brown people to wait patiently for a long time before a rising tide caught their leaky boats. Unmistakable disappointment surfaced in black weeklies like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier over what appeared to be stock Obama speeches to black middle-class audiences, in which the president exhorted them to shrug off past discriminations, ignore inadequate conditions, cease complaining, mind their domestic morals, and get ready for success. Atlantic Monthly senior editor Ta-Nehisi Coates addressed the troubling public statements in How the Obama Administration Talks to Black America, a critique that skirted outright censure. Still, Coates thought that black people, quote, deserve more than a sermon. It would be hard to deny the truth of Michael Eric Dyson's The Black Presidency. Quote, if Obama's delivery on race is sad and disappointing, he writes, the failure of most black Americans to hold him accountable is no less so. Were we to press our speculations on his posthumous opinions further, we would probably hear old contrarian DuBois insist that the problems experienced by the 44th president were not unique, that these same problems were experienced in the same intensity by the 32nd President of the United States. The former, denounced as illegitimate by reasons of birth and race, the latter as a traitor to his class. Some 80 years apart, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Barack Obama faced the same enemies. 1. Congressional obstructionism. 2. A hostile Supreme Court. 3. Wall Street. And 4. A South rising again. The German philosopher Friedrich Schlegel cautioned that historians serve the public best as prophets in reverse, rather than as commentators of fast-moving current events. The Obama presidency did end, indeed, with much to its credit, but the vision of a national post-racial reset that defined its historic debut had already been fatally belied by worsening disparities now become irrevocably color-coded, by Supreme Court majorities disingenuously mocking African American and Latino voting rights and poised to cancel women's reproductive rights, by criminal justice system outrages sparking corrective protests, Black Lives Matter, and long overdue policing of the police. Much of all this climaxed in the cause and effect of the dystopic Trump quadrennial, which was nothing less than white supremacy finally authorized to speak its demographic truth. What is to be said of the American experiment now that we have seen the best of us defied by the worst of us? DuBois had an intellectual's license to commend visionary prospects that no American politician could fully embrace, even if she wanted to. But politics without audacity leaves a commonwealth at risk. Permit me to closing, to share with you a long ago DuBois op-ed that reads existentially pertinent to the next midterm election. My friends, note, an election is coming up, he announced. So what? He added rhetorically. We are ruled by a minority armed with wealth and power. This usurpation we must fight, he exhorted. Here is a program for those who have not lost hope and who yet believe in America. Heal the sick as a privilege, not as charity. Make private ownership of natural resources a crime. Stop interference with private and personal belief by religious hypocrites. Preserve the utmost freedom for dream of beauty, creative art, and joy of living. Call this socialism, communism, reformed capitalism, or holy rolling. Call it anything, but get it done. Perhaps this is insane, but to me it is reason, right, and justice. Thank you all.